When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper, using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this episode, we reveal how, in the art world, forensic science uncovered the fakes being passed off as the real thing.
It's very important in these kinds of cases to hold people to account. It can also provide a warning to people who are wanting to buy these kinds of artworks that they need to be cautious.
And we reveal how tiny traces of evidence uncovered at a crime scene helped crack a complex murder investigation.
It was that element of waiting to deliver a fatal second blow that convicted him. And that's what the blood pattern gave us.
It's very gratifying being able to apply this set of skills to work with art. There is a market for deception. I would like to think that what we do is a deterrent.
Hale, Cornwall, 2009, where David Carter once ran an art gallery. Today, the gallery is no longer in business, but back then, it was the place to buy Cornish art, including the works of celebrated local artist Alfred Wallace.
Alfred Wallace was one of the many fishermen who lived here in Back Road West. This was the doorway in which he would stand of an evening.
He was a longshore fisherman in the earlier part of his life, then gave that up and became a local fisherman down in Cornwall. Then he gave that up and opened a kind of a stores where he could sell marine supplies to service the local fishing industry. And he then became, after his wife's death in about the 1920s, an amateur artist.
He couldn't afford canvas. He painted on the walls, on bits of board, both sides.
He was really painting not just what was around him, but what he remembered of what was around him. So he was painting sailboats when it was becoming steamboats and this kind of thing. He painted then through the 30s, never made much money, always struggled.
But when he was 86, he had to go to the workhouse, and there he lived. He painted until he died on August the 29th, 1942.
Over the last 20 years, Alfred Wallace's artworks have become increasingly sought after, as art journalist Georgina Adam has seen.
Alfred Wallace is what they call an outsider artist. An outsider is somebody who's outside the mainstream, who hasn't had training as an artist. He started painting in a very naive style. He didn't have money, so he would paint on all sorts of different things. He might paint on cardboard or on a biscuit tin, anything like that. And he became quite fashionable, and his works can actually sell for up to £100,000 now.
As an expert in Cornish painters, David Carter sold dozens of Wallace's works, and in March 2011, he advertised this painting for sale, claiming it was by Alfred Wallace.
One of the works of art that he sold was called Boats Leaving Newlyn Harbour, and he sold it to a woman for £5,000.
The woman was very pleased with her new painting, but believing it to be by Wallace and knowing his work was appreciating in value, she later decided to sell it and got a shock when the auctioneer told her it might be a fake.
The auctioneer expressed a lot of doubts, and she was very upset, obviously very disappointed, she said at the time, obviously because suddenly her purchase is worthless.
Ben Adams from Cornwall Trading Standards began an investigation. He started by examining the paperwork associated with the painting.
She had been told it had documented history, provenance to it, and it turned out that it was a very vague, patchy history, simply not authenticated by any paperwork.
Ben had a problem. With such little paperwork, all trading standards had to rely on were two differing opinions. One from an auctioneer who said the painting was a fake, the other from David Carter, who insisted it was genuine. What they needed was scientific proof from an expert witness.
I think expert witnesses are frightfully important in the art world, particularly for forensics, but also for connoisseurship. I mean, the artist isn't there to tell us if he painted it or not, so we need some other way of finding out if something is genuine or not.
Trading Standards turned to expert witness Dr. Nicholas Eastaugh, an expert in detecting fakes. That can involve analysing the brushstrokes, composition and general style of a painting.
There seem to be a number of artists who come up again and again in forgery. It looks as if the basic reason is that people think that they are easy to emulate. And for example, the works of Jackson Pollock, where you've got drips and splashes and people think these are easy to do. They're not, they're actually quite complicated. This is also the case with the artist Alfred Wallace. I think people mistake naivety for simplicity.
In this case, there was nothing about the style of the painting that rang alarm bells. Instead, Nicholas was more interested in what materials the artist had used.
You get slightly different questions when you get into a wholly self-taught artist like Alfred Wallace. He was using all sorts of different kind of painting materials. So not artist paints. He wasn't going to an art shop and say, sell me a tube of lead white. He was just picking up paints that you might paint your house with.
Wallace's use of everyday materials makes it harder to detect a forgery. But Nicholas has an arsenal of forensic methods that can unlock the secrets of any painting.
I can come in with scientific techniques and demonstrate what the painting is made of, when it might have been created. I can analyse it in terms of the construction and how this relates to the way the original artist would have worked. Just as an example of a painting that might come in for examination, this we actually know is sort of late 1940s. Once we've had an assessment of the painting overall and had a look under the microscope, we're on to sampling, and we have to decide just where to take the samples from. We take the smallest possible samples that's going to give us the information that we actually need. We can sample down in practice to material that's perhaps half the width of a human hair. And so we can just, in practice, the sample should be so small that when you go back to look at the painting, you can't see where the sample has come from. You might just be able to see that. There's the tiniest black speck. There's enough sample on there for doing multiple tests.
Nicholas applied the same precise analysis to boats leaving Newlyn Harbour and uncovered the first clues to the work's origins.
We found two pigments that were of interest. One was a form of titanium dioxide white pigment that's known as rutile. Now, this is essentially the white pigment that you'll be painting the walls of your house with today, but it came into use in the 20th century. The other pigment we found has a very awkward name. It's called phthalocyanine green. And with the phthalocyanine green, because it was notionally available in the 1930s, you could say, because Wallace died in 1942, it is possible that it found its way into a material. It's slightly different with the titanium dioxide white. This has a complicated history. It was first experimented on as a potential pigment really around sort of 1908 to 10. And then in the 1910s, it was developed as a commercial pigment, finally finding use from the 1920s on.
There are two types of titanium dioxide white, an early version called anatase, and a later version known as rutile. This was now key to solving the mystery.
They only found a good synthetic route to produce rutile-formed titanium white around 1940 or so. And essentially it wasn't available, wasn't used. You don't find it in artworks until well after Alfred Wallace had died. And because we found the rutile form of titanium white in these paintings, we could rule out Alfred Wallace.
David Carter had sold a fake. And now Cornwall Trade and Standards had the scientific evidence to prove it. So they raided his art gallery.
Then obtained a number of items, including 5 or 6 paintings in total, together with a computer, a number of documents, including invoices, receipts. That allowed us to piece together basically the history of the paintings. One in particular was described as an item in the style of Alfred Wallace. Now, that clearly showed that he bought the item effectively as a fake.
The evidence from the raid revealed that David Carter was buying cheap Wallace imitations on the internet from websites with names like Any Old Tat, and then selling them as the genuine article at an enormous profit.
So you've got 3 paintings along the back there, which are all from the same supplier. Those cost around about £500 each. The one on the left was up for a price of about £30,000 to £50,000. That one in the middle there was priced at £20,000 to £30,000. And the one on the right-hand side, that was as much as £18,000. It was sold for £5,000 in the end.
One of the works was a glass fishing float, which was painted with little boats on it, and he attempted to sell it for £60,000, which was an enormous amount of money.
This one was only purchased for £316.77, 20,000% roughly, price inflation. It was clear that we're talking about fraud here. Mr. Carter was being dishonest, basically.
Trading Standards now had enough evidence to press charges. David Carter pleaded guilty.
This is another case where, after all the evidence is put forward, they just say, yep, I did it. It saves us having to stand up in court.
He was sentenced to 12 months suspended. He was also sentenced to paying £50,000, and he was given 200 hours community work to do as well. It's for sure that Nicholas Eastaugh's work has been invaluable in rooting out such fakes and forgeries.
It's very important in these kinds of cases to hold people to account. It can also provide a warning to people who are wanting to buy these kinds of artworks that they need to be cautious.
In our next story, the evidence was blood. The story it told revealed the killer's lies and put him behind bars.
It looks like the source of the wet blood would have been in front of the shoe. And this is exactly the sort of pattern we might see from a heavy impact into blood.
Heston Motorway services near London, 2007. A guest has been murdered in one of the rooms. Senior investigating officer at the Metropolitan Police, Tim Grattan Kane, was on call.
It was Saturday, the 15th of September 2007. And we received a call to go to the travel lodge at the Heston service area next to the M4 motorway. We went to a ground floor room and had discovered the body of a young man, Gareth MacDonald, totally lifeless, on top of a bed. There was an enormous amount of blood on the bedding, on the sheets, and it appeared at an early stage that the round base of the fire extinguisher, that was the murder weapon, and that had been used to strike Gareth on the head.
Gareth MacDonald was a father of 3 from Prestatyn, North Wales. His death had been reported by his boyfriend, Glenn Rycroft, who Gareth had met online the year before. They were on a trip to visit Rycroft's aunt. Rycroft claimed Gareth was safe and well when he left the room at 7 a.m. But when he returned 15 minutes later, Gareth was dead. It was an horrific story, but for Tim, something didn't quite add up.
It appeared immediately to those officers who attended the scene that this was implausible, certainly not normal, that you would go to a hotel next to a major motorway with many people occupying it at that time on a Saturday morning, and that someone would have come into that hotel, into a particular room, and beaten someone to death.
There were other puzzling elements. There was no sign of forced entry. Rycroft was also stained with the victim's blood, and his fingerprints were on the murder weapon. But he had an explanation for this.
He made efforts to hug Gareth's body, which meant that he himself became covered in blood. And he also claimed that in the rush to deal with them, he'd picked up the fire extinguisher, which had blood on it, and he'd moved it out of the way.
Rycroft's actions had contaminated the crime scene. Finding conclusive forensic evidence now would be a major challenge, so Tim turned to one of the UK's top expert witnesses, Philip Avenel, a specialist in using blood spatter patterns to tell the story of a crime.
What we do is we examine them under a light source, usually using a microscope, in order to look and identify absolutely all of the stains, their position, their approximate size and their shape, because each of these things tell us something slightly different about how that stain was deposited.
Any blood patterns on Glenn Rycroft's clothes would have been contaminated when he hugged Gareth, so Philip started his examination with Rycroft's shoes.
The right shoe had some blood staining on it, but there wasn't anything really distinctive on it, whereas the left shoe had very clear impact spatter on it.
While Philip examined evidence from the crime scene, Tim started looking into Gareth's boyfriend, Glenn Rycroft. And it didn't take long to find out Rycroft was already well known to the police.
He had a complex history. He'd been a convicted fraudster who had perpetrated absolutely audacious frauds against friends, members of his own family.
In fact, Rycroft's crimes had already made national news.
Good evening, welcome to the 6 o'clock news.
First tonight, mean, wicked and heartless. Tonight, a former British Airways cabin steward is beginning a 4-year jail sentence for conning his friends and family by claiming he had cancer. Glenn Rycroft from Manchester pretended he had a brain tumour and raised tens of thousands of pounds. He said it was to pay for treatment abroad. Instead, it went on living the high life and a string of foreign holidays.
In 2003, Rycroft admitted 25 charges of obtaining money by deception, a total of £200,000. 3 years later, he started a relationship with Gareth MacDonald, and in his statement to the police, claimed he was now trying to pay back his debts, starting with his own family.
The reason for their trip down to London, Glenn was due to come down to meet his uncle and aunt to give them back £5,000 that he had defrauded from them. Glenn and Gareth had set off from the northwest. They were due to be in London shortly after lunchtime. Glenn had spoken to his uncle and aunt, saying that they were stuck, they were delayed, they were lost, they wouldn't make it at this time, they'd be a little bit later.
But the couple never turned up to meet Rycroft's aunt and uncle.
So what happened that evening is that they went to the travel lodge at Heston Services, booked in for the night. They went for a meal in the service area and then went back to their room. Glenn Rycroft found a fire extinguisher outside their room and took this fire extinguisher into the bedroom with them. He and Gareth had gone to sleep. He'd woken up in the morning, was seen to drive off in their car. He went down the M4. And when he came back, he found Gareth lying on the bed.
For Tim, Rycroft's story just didn't add up. Why had they not gone to meet his aunt and uncle? Where was the £5,000? Why did they stay at Heston Services?
Everything was designed to delay the time when he would have to go and meet his uncle and aunt and hand over this £5,000 that he allegedly had, but we found no trace of.
It was all very suspicious. And back at the lab, Philip was also making some discoveries among the bloodstains on Glenn Rycroft's shoes.
The first picture I've got in front of me is a front-on view of the shoe, showing lots of a distribution of spots across the shoe of varying sizes, but many of them very small. The small bloodstains won't travel very far, so you can start to get an idea of how far away it was as well, and this showed that the shoe had been close to an impact into wet blood. We also, because of the colour and the texture of the material that the items are made out of, it's not always easy to clearly see the blood. We use some software to convert it into a digital sketch. You can see from this diagram, you can see actually there's a lot more blood on there than you actually see with the naked eye when you're looking at it. So it really highlights there is a heavy impact into wet blood that's happened there.
Rycroft claimed to have found Gareth dead when he returned to the room. But blood pattern evidence on Rycroft's shoes was telling a different story. It showed he must have been in the room when MacDonald was struck. Tim now had evidence rather than just suspicions. But he needed more, so he began to look more closely at Rycroft and MacDonald's relationship.
Gareth MacDonald, at the time of his death, was a 30-year-old young man. He had been married, he had 3 young children, wasn't certain as to his sexuality, formed a relationship with Rycroft. And it became quite clear when you spoke to Gareth's family that he was starting to have concerns about the relationship. He always seemed to be paying for everything.
Tim believed that Gareth was becoming suspicious of Glenn. Text messages confirmed they had been arguing about money. And when Tim expanded the investigation into Rycroft's internet history, he made a chilling discovery.
We took the computer and a load of documentation from Rycroft's home address, an analysis of the searches, how to kill people, whether a blow to the head would kill people.
Chilling as it was, this was all circumstantial evidence. Tim needed more proof of what actually happened inside the hotel room. Blood spatter on Rycroft's shoes showed he was standing close to MacDonald when he was struck. Now, Tim needed expert witness Philip Avenel to work out what happened next.
We looked at the trousers that the individual was wearing, or that were recovered from him when he was taken into police custody.
Rycroft's trousers were covered in blood from when he had hugged Gareth's body.
There was a lot of heavy blood staining on the trousers. This is what we call contact blood staining. So the item has come into contact, it's led against something that's wet with blood, or something wet with blood has led against it. So there's difficulties when you have lots of heavy blood stains and lots of different types of blood patterns all overlaying each other. It then makes it quite difficult to pull it apart and to work out exactly what's there. And that's when you're really looking at the very fine, small detail in the blood.
Philip began a minute examination of the bloodstains on Rycroft's trousers and found a tiny but vital clue.
About halfway up on the left leg, we found 3 very small blood spots, which is blood that's travelled through the air and landed on the surface of the trousers.
DNA testing found these spots were MacDonald's blood, but there was something else. The consistency was different to the other stains. That meant these blood stains were made at a different time.
They were what's known as clotted blood. As we all know, when we cut our hands, then our bleeding will slowly stop and we'll end up with thick, heavy blood, which is clotted blood that's dried.
Philip now turned his attention to the bedsheets. They were also soaked in blood. But amidst the heavy staining, Philip found further evidence of clotted blood, just like on Rycroft's trousers.
We could see where the impact had happened and the blood had radiated out from the point of impact. the initial impact, the blood then starting to flow, and then there's a time delay for that blood to then start clotting, and then there has been a second impact into that blood after that.
To Philip, this was evidence for a timeline of events. It showed MacDonald had been struck once. Then minutes later, as the blood was starting to clot, he was struck a second time.
So we knew there had been an impact into blood after there had been a period of time of bleeding, and typically that is between 3 to 15 minutes.
Philip's analysis proved this was not a frenzied attack. It showed there had been at least 2 blows, and that these blows were minutes apart.
You look at what you've got, you're trying to understand the sequence of events and what's happened, and it's interesting when you can then start to piece them together.
It gave us the definitive answer. DNA wouldn't have done that. We knew they were there. Fingerprints wouldn't have done that. We knew they were both there. But the way this blood arose was a matter of scientific proof. He had been present at the moment Gareth was hit with the murder weapon. And it was that that had sprayed the blood onto his trousers and onto his boots. We will never know whether the first blow was just purely to stun, but what we do know is that the second blow definitely caused his death. Massive injuries.
In July 2009, Glenn Rycroft stood trial at the Old Bailey. Central to the prosecution's case was evidence from expert witness Philip Avenel.
It was that element of waiting to deliver a fatal second blow that convicted him. And that's what the blood pattern gave us. It gave us the definitive answer.
I think a good expert witness is somebody that is able to stand back and look at whatever they've got in front of them in a very objective way, and distancing themselves completely from the individuals or anything that's happened in it, and just being able to look at the science and break it down and truly understand what the science means and then present it.
The version of events given by Rycroft could be proved to be a lie.